אני מזמין עכשיו את פרופסור משה ברנסטיין מישיבה יוניברסיטי. כן, יש מי שלא מסתדר עם עברית? מבינים אותי, אז אני אציג בעברית. כן, בסדר. אוקיי, משה ברנסטיין? לא? בסדר? אוקיי, כן, הוא חוקר נודע, כן, שעוסק שנים רבות הן בספרות בית שני, הן במגילות, הן בטקסטים הארמיים של בית שני, ואנחנו נזכה עכשיו לשמוע את הרצאתו Reading the Genesis Apocryphon, המגילה החיצונית לבראשית, as biblical commentary.
פותחים בכבוד האכסניה. אני רוצה לקחת את ההזדמנות הזאת כמרצה הראשון מחוץ לארץ, להודות בשם חבריי מחו"ל למארגנים ולמסדרים של הכנס הזה. כולנו שמחנו על ההזמנה להשתתף, ומקווים כולנו שנתרום כל אחד ואחד בתחומו ובשיטתו למחקר פרשנות המקרא לדורותיה. Dictionary definition of commentary includes a series of explanatory notes or annotations, often forming a treatise on a text, or, quote, an expository treatise or series of annotations and exegesis. Very often when dictionaries talk about commentaries, they go out of their way to associate the term commentary with biblical commentary in particular. We in the field of biblical studies, therefore, have a pretty clear sense of what we think that a commentary is or should look like. A work formally built upon another work, citing pieces of the text on which it will remark, which we call the lemmas or diburei hamatchil, and omitting the rest. As a result, it is very simple to distinguish the commentary from the text on which it comments. Whatever follows the lemma is the commentary, and can clearly be attributed to an author different from the composer of the lemmas and the text from which they were taken. In Jewish antiquity, the most obvious examples of this type of commentary are probably the Qumran Psharim, although they differ from other commentaries in very significant ways, or rabbinical exegetical midrashim such as Bereshit Rabbah. But from the Middle Ages on, biblical commentary has been one of the most productive forms of Jewish literary creativity, as witnessed the proportion of the papers at this distinguished conference deriving from that era tomorrow. Without a doubt, the invention or the creation of the commentary form has saved a great deal of writing material through the ages, since before that time, in order to produce the effect of a commentary, it was necessary to repeat the contents of the whole text being commented upon to a greater or lesser degree, and to insert or include within that repetition that which the commentator wanted to say about the base text. Needless to say, I'm thinking along the lines that led the late Geza Vermesh in 1961 to formulate his classic definition of the literary form rewritten Bible, never realizing the controversies that he was setting the foundation for a half a century later and more. Vermesh characterized the works that he includes under this now debatable rubric with the following statement, and I quote, "In order to anticipate questions and to solve problems in advance, the midrashist," I never would use that word, "inserts Haggadic development into the biblical narrative, an exegetical process which is probably as ancient as scriptural interpretation in itself," end quote. The retold story now contains the interpretation that would have gone into a comment had the genuine commentary form existed already. So the form rewritten Bible, or rewritten scripture if you prefer that, is a kind of proto-commentary. And we should not forget that although Vermesh neglected to include it in his list, the book of Chronicles, Divrei Hayamim, is one of our earliest examples of this type of work, retelling the material in Samuel and Kings with changes, some of which are exegetical, while others are tendentious. One of the works that Vermesh included in his list, and which has remained fairly constantly on other lists under that generic rubric, is the Genesis Apocryphon, or as its initial editors characterized it, Megillah Chitzonit Livreshit, without a definite article, not the, but a Genesis Apocryphon. It is a work that I have discussed often in the past and which can be studied from a variety of perspectives, one of which happens to be that of biblical commentary. The Apocryphon, for those of you medievalists who avoid the literature of Bayit Sheni, is a fragmentary scroll from Cave 1 at Qumran, written in Aramaic, that retold, when it was complete, at least the narratives of Genesis 5 through 15. It may very well derive from two or more sources, with part 1, the Lemech Noach material, being heavily extra-biblical, wandering freely away from the biblical text in its retelling, and part 2, the Abram material, maintaining greater fidelity to the biblical text and narrative in its presentation, while inserting a variety of expansions, some large and some small. It is related to more famous and more complete works, such as Enoch and Jubilees, but I am not sure whether all of us who are sitting and speaking in today's double session would agree on just what the nature of that relationship is. For most of the work, the story is told by the major character who is present on the scene. The supplementary material that the Genesis Apocryphon, like other members of this genre, attaches to its retelling of the biblical narrative is not all cut from the same cloth, and therefore cannot be considered uniformly when discussing the Apocryphon as a commentary. I'm going to divide it up roughly into three categories, which are always quite subjective. The material that I would exclude from being considered as commentary would include facts and information that have no scriptural basis and that do not resolve any difficult issues in the biblical narrative. For example, I suggest that the highly fragmentary conversation between Methuselah and Hanoch in columns 3 to 5, which was impelled by Lemech's doubts about the legitimacy of his son Noach, and the conversations between God and Noach in columns 6 and 7 don't belong to the commentary aspect, since neither one is linked in any overt way with Scripture. The other two categories, which I think are more difficult to distinguish from one another, are additions that solve genuine textual issues in a compelling fashion, and those which create solutions that aren't necessarily compelling. From the standpoint of the composer, there may not be very much difference between them, and it may be only our 21st century judgment that would argue that they're unalike. Now, I must note that that part 1 is more difficult to evaluate as commentary because of two factors. First of all, it's very, very fragmentary, but second of all, and perhaps more important, is there is a greater distance between it and the biblical text than there is in part 2. So now let's get to the different kinds of commentary. The most fundamental form of commentary, of course, is translation of a text. And whereas it is certainly not correct to assign the Apocryphon to the genre of Targum, as was frequently done when it was first published, we do find in the Apocryphon a number of passages where the author has chosen to render the Hebrew biblical text into Aramaic. And I'm trying to choose my examples here from part 1, which is less attached to the Hebrew than part 2, in order to demonstrate that this phenomenon runs through both parts. So, number 1 on the handout, Genesis 8:4, Vatanach HaTeva al Harei Ararat, becomes in the Genesis Apocryphon, Tevuta Nechat Chad Min Turei Horarat. The ark rested on one of the mountains of Harat. That's a pretty fairly close rendition of the Hebrew in the middle of what is not a translation. Sometimes we can see the Apocryphon is working closely with the Hebrew text, but not quite in the exact order. So when we look at example 2 on the handout, and let's look at the Aramaic first. V'ha'ana yahevlach v'livnach kola lemechal biyarka v'isba di'ara bram kol dam la techalon ematchon v'dachalatchon, and it breaks off. So we have elements of Genesis 9, 2 through 4 rearranged, beginning with a virtual Targum of Genesis 9, 3. Lachem yiel ochla ki yerek esev natati lachem et kol. followed by the prohibition against eating blood, Genesis 9:4, ach basar benafsho damo lo tochelu, where the Apocryphon starts out with Bram equals ach, but then moves to the language most likely of Leviticus 3:17, v'chol dam lo tochelu, and then returns to the beginning of Genesis 9:2, umora'achem v'chitachem. So he's begun by translating 9:3, proceeded to begin 9:4 only to substitute another verse for it, and then proceeds to 9:2, which unfortunately breaks off at that point. But you see that he is staying very close to the biblical text, even if he's massaging it and rearranging it. On occasion, we can sense how the Apocryphon translates the Hebrew text, even when the rendition is not explicit. It is fairly clear that the Apocryphon leaves out the story of the drunkenness of Noach from its narrative, and in its place, Noach has a lengthy prophetic dream. Daniel Machila has made the suggestion, which I find very attractive, that the author of the Apocryphon has read the word vayitgal in Genesis 9:21, which is usually rendered, he uncovered himself, to mean rather, vayitgal, he received a revelation, and then proceeds to present the dream which Noach had. I think that's an implicit interpretation of the text there. Let me offer quickly just two examples of the Apocryphon as translation from part 2, where there are actually a lot more options. So number 3 on the handout, Vayinaga Hashem et Paro negaim gedolim et beito, has a word order that's a little bit awkward. So the Apocryphon rewrites it as Gevaru Alohi Machtashaya v'Nagdaya v'al kol enash beitei. His plagues and beatings grew stronger upon him and all the people of his household. It's much smoother than the Hebrew original, which is a little bumpy. And number 4 on the handout, Genesis 4:15, Vayechalek alehem laila, an idiom which is not easy to translate literally. The Apocryphon renders it Urama alehon belelia min arba ruchehon. He shot against them at night from 4 directions. The text, of course, now is much more smoothly and nicely handled. One of the other techniques that the Apocryphon employs is the addition of details to the story that enables it to flow more smoothly. This too is a feature of commentary, which is part of both the microstructure and macrostructure of the work. Supplementation of small details. At times, the Apocryphon will furnish details that are omitted from the biblical account in order to respond to possible questions by the reader. This is the micro version of what I'm going to call in a moment gap filling when it talks about bigger scale. How does Pharaoh find out that Sarai is Abram's wife and that his suffering is due to that fact? The Apocryphon informs us that when Hyrcanosh, one of the nobles, comes to Lot and asks him to pass on the request to Abram to pray on behalf of Pharaoh, Lot tells him that Abram cannot do so while his wife Sarai is in Pharaoh's possession. That's not in the biblical text, but it makes the story go better. When Abram and Sarai are about to be expelled from Egypt, we are told that the king, in number 5, on the handout, gave her much silver and gold, much clothing of linen and purple, and something or other before her, and also Hagar. The introduction of Hagar into the narrative at this point has to be intended to anticipate and explain her presence in the narrative later on at Genesis 16:1, V'la shivcha mitzrit ushma Hagar. Where did she get the shivcha mitzrit? Well, the Apocryphon tells us earlier in order to make the story go along. Both of these are reasonable interpolations into the biblical story, but are not at all compelled by the text. After the battle of the 4 kings versus the 5 and the capture of Lot, we read in number 6 of the handout, in Genesis 14:13, Vayavo hapalit vayaged la'Avram ha'ivri. The escapee came and informed Abram the Hebrew. The Bible is quite uninformative as to the identity of this individual, so the Apocryphon does more than merely identify him. At the beginning of column 22, we read, and you see there in lines 1 and 2, one of the shepherds whom Abram had given to Lot. one who escaped from the captivity, came to Abram and told him that Lot his nephew and all his flocks had been taken captive, but he was not killed. This messenger, who has now been identified, is then given another task by the Apocryphon's author to resolve another question. He informs Abram that the kings had set forth by way of the great valley to their country, taking captives, plundering, destroying, and killing, and that they were on their way to the city of Damascus. From where else would Abram have obtained this piece of military intelligence? How would he have known where to pursue the kings? Now, in the course of their defeat by the coalition of the four kings, number 7 on the handout, we know that the biblical narrative tells us that the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled and fell into the bitumen pits that covered the battlefield. Right? Well, later on, the king of Sodom comes forth to greet Abram upon his return from the battle in Genesis 14:17. The Apocryphon's composer didn't like that. How did he get out of the pit? So the Apocryphon's composer says, aha, only the king of Gomorrah fell into the pit, while the king of Sodom flees. And you'll notice he writes, the king of Sodom was shattered or smitten and ran away, while the king of Omrim, which is Gomorrah, fell into the pits. Now, when the supplementations of details reaches a certain scope, I prefer call it gap filling. And this is one of the characteristics of rewritten scripture, the filling out of what appear to be gaps of different sorts in the biblical account. And the author of the Apocryphon employs this technique as well. This activity is also part of the commentary method, as it facilitates a reading of the text that will enable the reader to pause less frequently to ask questions. I stress, however, that because the gap fillers are often merely products of the composer's creativity, they belong to the not necessarily compelling aspects of the commentary. And here are some examples. When Abram and Sarai are on the verge of entry into Egypt, Abram has a dream about a palm tree and a cedar tree, in which the palm saves the cedar from being cut down by crying out that they come from the same root. He interprets the dream as foretelling an impending, this is column 19, lines 14 to 17, which are not on the handout. He interprets the dream as foretelling an impending threat to him and Sarai, with an attempt on his life that only she can avert by declaring that he is her brother. This is meant to explain how Abram knows that Sarai is at risk in Egypt, and why he adopts the amoral response of lying in order to save them, as has been pointed out by others in the past. Other ancient sources formulate a variety of reasons for Abram's behavior, but Genesis Apocryphons is certainly one of the most creative. More demanded, perhaps, by the narrative is the lengthy poem at the beginning of column 20 that describes the beauty of Sarai in great detail. Although its beginning is lacking, when we read at the end of the poem, and I quote this, when the king heard the words of Hyrcanosh and the words of his companions, the three of whom spoke with one voice, he loved her greatly, sent for her quickly, led her off, saw her, and marveled at all her beauty. It is clear that the whole poem must have been spoken by the three of them, and that it represents an expansion of the words in the Bible, quote, the nobles of Pharaoh saw her and praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken to the palace of Pharaoh, end quote. The poem may have other literary functions as well within the narrative, such as the retardation of the action in order to keep the listener in suspense. But its contribution to the commentary aspect of the Apocryphon cannot be denied. I thought I had 3, but okay, fine. All right. An example of intertextuality. In number, I hope this is number 8. Yes, it is. In number 8 on the handout, the Apocryphon comes to solve a problem which is solved often by texts like the Samaritan Pentateuch and Rabbinic Midrashim, when there seems to be a reference to something earlier in Scripture that isn't there in our text. So when we read in Genesis 20:13, and it was when God made me wander from my ancestral home, I said to her, this be the kindness that you do with me, wherever we go, say he's my brother. Well, it doesn't say anything like that before Genesis 20:13 in the book of Genesis. But the author of the Apocryphon finds a way to integrate this into his rewriting of Genesis 12, 12 to 13. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, she is his wife, they will kill me and let you live. Please say that you are my sister, so that it will go well with me on your account, and my soul will live because of you. That's the Hebrew text. He says, they will seek to kill me and leave you alone. But let this be the whole kindness that you shall do with me. Wherever we go, say he is my brother. So there we have Genesis 20:13 plugged back into Genesis 12, the way the rabbis would say the Torah says, kasher diber v'hechan diber. And the Apocryphon finds a way to introduce it. Okay. Let me take one final example. And here we see the author of the Apocryphon. This is the last one on the handout. It's number 12. In the same wife-sister story, we find the author of the Apocryphon borrowing material which echoes two stories later in the Pentateuch. One from the Pharaoh Joseph narrative and the other from the Pharaoh Moses one. And I've italicized the biblical quotations. And here it goes. It's there in front of you. At the end of 2 years, the afflictions and plagues against him and all the men of his household grew more intense. Now, a quotation. And he sent and called all the wise men of Egypt and all the magicians. Think of Genesis 41:8 and Exodus 7:11. With all the doctors of Egypt, thinking that they might cure him and the men of his household from this affliction. And all the doctors and the magicians and wise men were unable to stand to heal him because the Spirit was afflicting all of them. Think Exodus 9:11. And they ran away. If the language is simply modeled on the later passages of Genesis and Exodus without any conceptual goal, then we simply have a case of the Apocryphon borrowing one piece of Bible for stylistic reasons. But on the other hand, and this goes beyond commentary, if the language that is drawn from the stories of the two later pharaohs in the time of Joseph and the time of the Exodus was employed consciously by the composer of the Apocryphon, then we have evidence of a sort of theological sophistication that goes well beyond the drawing of analogies between historical incidents. The linguistic suggestion that the behavior and fates of these three Egyptian kings are linked would indicate a way of reading the Pentateuch that we might very well not have expected in this period. Thank you.